Most locomotives wear out from hard work, miles of track, thousands of hours under load, the constant punishment of hauling tonnage across a continent. That is the normal way an engine ages. The Fairbanks-Morse H-16-44 did something different, something that puzzled the railroad men who operated it and the mechanics who maintained it. This locomotive sometimes deteriorated while sitting still, not from use, not from abuse, but from inactivity. The very thing that should have preserved it ended up hurting it. And for years, the railroads blamed the design, blamed the builder, blamed the complexity of a very unusual engine. What they did not understand was that this locomotive came from a different world, a world where engines ran continuously, a world where idleness was the exception, not the rule. This is the story of the Fairbanks-Morse H-16-44, an engine that needed motion to survive, and what happened when the railroads did not know that yet. To understand why the H-16-44 seemed so promising, you have to understand who built it. Fairbanks-Morse was not some upstart locomotive builder trying to break into the market. This was a company with roots going back to 1823, when Thaddeus Fairbanks opened an iron works in St. Johnsbury, Vermont. By the time they started building locomotives, Fairbanks-Morse had been in the heavy industrial business for over a century. They had made weighing scales, windmills, pumps, and engines of every description. Their main manufacturing plant in Beloit, Wisconsin, had become one of the most respected engine factories in America, and their reputation rested heavily on one particular achievement: powering the United States Navy's submarine fleet. During World War II, Fairbanks-Morse engines drove American submarines through the Pacific. The company's opposed-piston diesels proved themselves in conditions that would destroy lesser machinery. Constant operation, high loads, extreme temperatures, saltwater environments. These engines ran around the clock for months at a time, and they held up. When the war ended and the railroads began their transition from steam to diesel power, Fairbanks-Morse saw an opportunity. They had an engine design that had survived submarine warfare. Surely it could handle pulling freight cars across Kansas. The sales pitch was compelling. Their opposed-piston engine had fewer moving parts than conventional diesels, no cylinder heads to warp or leak, excellent fuel efficiency. The same basic engine that kept American submariners alive was now available to haul your coal trains. In December 1934, the U.S. Navy had ordered their first Fairbanks-Morse opposed-piston engines for the submarines USS Plunger and USS Pollock. By the end of World War II, these engines had compiled an impressive service record. They remained standard on American diesel-powered submarines through the early 1960s, and variants continue to provide backup power on nuclear submarines to this day. If an engine could survive inside a submarine operating in combat conditions, what could possibly go wrong on a railroad? The H-16-44 entered production in April 1950. The locomotive shared its platform with the earlier H-15-44, but used an uprated version of the 38D818 opposed-piston engine, producing 1,600 horsepower. Industrial designer Raymond Loewy gave it a distinctive appearance with sloped body lines and beveled edges. It looked modern. It looked capable. Railroads took notice. Over the course of production, Fairbanks-Morse would build 209 H-16-44s for American railroads, another 58 through the Canadian Locomotive Company in Kingston, Ontario, and 32 units for Mexican railroads. The last H-16-44 rolled off the line in 1963, making it one of the longer production runs in the Fairbanks-Morse locomotive catalog. The assumption seemed reasonable. An engine that survived warships would certainly thrive on rails. That assumption was wrong. Before we continue, if you think our content is unique and informative, please leave a like and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Also, make sure to share the video with other train fanatics out there. Before we can understand what went wrong with the H-16-44, we need to understand what made its engine so unusual and why it works so well in other applications. The Fairbanks-Morse 38D818 was a two-stroke diesel, but not like any two-stroke most people would recognize. Instead of having one piston per cylinder with a cylinder head at the top, this engine had two pistons per cylinder facing each other. There was no cylinder head at all. The combustion chamber formed in the center of the cylinder, in the space between the two approaching pistons. This design had several theoretical advantages. With two pistons absorbing the force of combustion instead of one piston and a fixed cylinder head, you could extract more work from each power stroke. The engine achieved a higher stroke-to-bore ratio without excessive piston speeds, and without a cylinder head, you eliminated one of the most common failure points in any engine. The engine had two crankshafts, one at the top and one at the bottom, connected by a vertical gear train. When the pistons moved apart after combustion, they each turned their respective crankshaft. The timing between the two crankshafts was coordinated precisely through the gear connection. Air intake and exhaust were handled through ports in the cylinder walls rather than through valves. As the pistons moved outward toward their respective crankshafts, they uncovered these ports. The intake ports were located near the top of the cylinder, the exhaust ports near the bottom. A Roots-type blower provided the positive air charge needed for scavenging and combustion. On paper, this was an elegant design. In practice, it excelled under very specific conditions. Submarines gave the 38D818 everything it needed to perform well. The engines ran at relatively constant loads. When a submarine was running on diesel power, those engines were working steadily, not cycling between idle and full throttle the way a locomotive might. The operating environment was controlled. Sea-level air pressure, consistent temperatures, seawater available for cooling. Most importantly, the engines rarely sat idle for extended periods. A submarine at sea kept its diesels running. This continuous operation was not just convenient, it was essential to the engine's health. The opposed piston design relied on continuous lubrication flow to protect its internal components. Oil needed to reach the upper pistons, which were positioned higher than in a conventional engine. The rings, the cylinder walls, the connecting rod bearings all depended on a steady supply of lubricant that only came when the engine was running. When the engine ran, oil circulated. Temperatures stayed uniform, metal expanded evenly, the ports stayed clear of deposits, everything worked as designed. What the Navy discovered, and what the railroads would learn later, was that this engine was not particularly tolerant of being shut down and left to sit. Here is where the H-16-44's troubles began. A railroad operates differently than a submarine fleet. Submarines on patrol ran their diesels almost continuously when not submerged. A locomotive might sit in a yard for days or weeks between assignments. It might make a run, get parked in a siding, and wait for its next call. Seasonal traffic meant some units worked constantly during harvest or winter heating season, then sat idle through slower periods. For a conventional diesel engine, this was not necessarily a problem. An EMD 567 or 645 could tolerate periods of inactivity without significant deterioration. These were four-stroke engines with conventional layouts, and while they certainly benefited from regular operation, they did not actively degrade from sitting still. The opposed piston engine was different. When an OP engine shuts down, several things begin to happen. Oil drains away from the upper components. On a conventional engine, gravity pulls oil back to the sump, but the critical components are all below the oil level, or receive splash lubrication easily at startup. On the opposed piston engine, the upper crankshaft, upper pistons, and upper connecting rods are positioned well above the oil sump. When the engine stops, oil drains away from these components and stays away until the engine runs again. The piston rings begin to lose their oil film. In operation, oil constantly replenishes the thin layer between the rings and the cylinder walls. When the engine sits, this film breaks down. The rings can begin to stick in their grooves as oil residue hardens. Carbon deposits that would normally be swept away by the motion of the pistons and the flow of exhaust gases instead solidify in place. Temperature cycling becomes destructive. Every day the ambient temperature rises and falls. The metal of the engine expands and contracts. Condensation forms inside the cylinders when temperatures drop. This moisture has nowhere to go. It collects in the ports, on the cylinder walls, on any surface where it can cling. And moisture plus iron plus time equals corrosion. The intake and exhaust ports were particularly vulnerable. In operation, the constant flow of air and exhaust kept these passages clear. When the engine sat, carbon deposits accumulated and hardened. Moisture promoted oxidation. The ports that controlled all air movement through the engine gradually fouled without anything actually wearing out. What made this especially insidious was that none of it looked like conventional wear. A mechanic opening up an engine that had been running hard would expect to find worn bearings, scored cylinder walls, damaged valve seats, evidence of work done. An opposed piston engine that had been sitting showed something different. Components that should have been functional were stuck, corroded, or fouled. Compression was down, but not because the rings were worn. Compression was down because the rings were gummed in place and could not seal properly. Nothing was broken in the traditional sense, but everything was quietly deteriorating. The lubricating oils available in the late 1940s and 1950s compounded the problem. Modern engine oils contain sophisticated additive packages designed to resist oxidation, prevent corrosion, and maintain their properties during storage. The oils of that era were simpler formulations. They were designed for engines that ran regularly. They did not contain the corrosion inhibitors that would protect idle machinery. When an H-16-44 sat in a railroad yard for weeks at a time, the oil coating its internal components slowly changed. Exposure to air, to the acids that form in combustion residue, to the moisture that accumulated in the crankcase, all degraded the oil's protective qualities. The lubricant that was supposed to protect the engine gradually became part of the problem. Railroad storage practices of the era did not help. There was no established protocol for preserving diesel locomotives during extended downtime. Steam locomotives had required specific procedures when taken out of service, including draining boilers, protecting bearings, and covering openings. Diesels were still new enough that comparable procedures had not been developed, at least not for the peculiarities of opposed-piston engines. Most railroads simply parked locomotives when they were not needed. No periodic rotation of the engine. No preservation oil applied to vulnerable surfaces. The units sat where they were left, subject to whatever weather came through. Restarting an engine that had been sitting for an extended period became problematic. The first few seconds of operation were the most damaging. Oil pressure had to build before lubricant reached the upper components. Those upper pistons, upper connecting rod bearings, and upper crankshaft journals ran essentially dry until the oil pump caught up. Each restart created a small amount of wear that would not have occurred if the engine had simply kept running. The rings, stuck in their grooves from hardened oil residue, scraped rather than sealed. Combustion was uneven because compression varied between cylinders. Carbon that had accumulated in the ports broke loose in chunks, causing temporary blockages and erratic airflow. Railroads that kept their FM units in regular daily service noticed fewer of these problems. The Southern Pacific, which used FM power extensively in the San Francisco Bay Area, maintained a substantial fleet that stayed busy with commuter and local freight assignments. The Long Island Railroad, with its constant demand for suburban passenger service, similarly kept its FM locomotives in steady rotation. But railroads that assigned FM units to secondary service, or that held them in reserve for peak periods, found themselves dealing with machinery that seemed to resist coming back to life. A locomotive that had worked fine a month earlier now ran rough, made unusual noises, consumed excessive oil, and generally acted unreliable. The railroads drew what seemed like logical conclusions from their experience. When an H-16-44 that had been sitting in the yard proved difficult to restart and ran poorly once it was running, the maintenance department blamed the locomotive. The opposed piston engine was complex. It required procedures and knowledge that the shop forces did not have. Parts were not interchangeable with the EMD equipment that dominated most railroad rosters. Therefore, the reasoning went, the Fairbanks-Morse product was fundamentally flawed. This interpretation had some validity. The OP engine was genuinely more difficult to maintain than an EMD 5i67. Replacing a power assembly on the FM engine required moving the locomotive under a crane and removing the roof hatch, upper crankcase, upper caps, upper connecting rod caps, and upper crankshaft. The same job on an EMD could be done much more quickly with fewer specialized tools. Author John Kirkland, in his book on Fairbanks-Morse locomotives, identified a critical factor in FM's troubled reputation. On railroads where EMD power predominated, maintenance personnel were trained either by EMD factory schools or by railroad staff who had learned EMD procedures. Shop supervisors knew EMD equipment intimately. When FM locomotives arrived, they were often maintained as if they were EMDs because that was what the workers knew how to do. The FM maintenance manuals stayed unopened in lockers. The specific procedures that the opposed piston engine required were not followed because no one had learned them. The result was predictable. Locomotives maintained incorrectly developed problems that correctly maintained locomotives did not have. Those problems reinforced the perception that the design was faulty. But even this explanation does not fully account for what happened. The fundamental issue was not just maintenance procedures, it was operational patterns. EMD locomotives tolerated storage better. Their conventional engines, while not immune to the effects of inactivity, were more forgiving. An EMD unit that had been sitting for a month might need a careful startup, but it would generally come back to life without major intervention. The OP engine needed more. It needed the motion that kept its lubrication systems working, its ports clear, its rings free. The railroads that recognized this, consciously or not, got good service from their FM locomotives. The railroads that treated them like any other diesel, available when needed and parked when not, found themselves constantly fighting reliability problems. By the time this pattern might have become clear, the market had moved on. Fairbanks-Morse exited the locomotive business in 1963. EMD and General Electric divided the market between them. The opposed-piston engine returned to its original domain, marine and stationary power applications, where continuous operation was the norm. The story of the H-16-44 contains a lesson that applies far beyond this one locomotive. Some machinery is designed for continuous duty. It expects to run around the clock, day after day, with only brief pauses for routine maintenance. Its designers assumed it would be used that way. Its lubrication system, its cooling system, its wear surfaces all depend on regular motion to function properly. When such machinery is used intermittently, when it is started and stopped and left sitting for extended periods, it experiences stresses that its designers never anticipated. The very features that made it durable under continuous operation can make it vulnerable to the effects of inactivity. The Fairbanks-Morse opposed-piston engine was this type of machinery. It had proven itself in submarine service where it ran steadily for extended periods. It could have proven itself in railroad service under similar conditions, on routes where power was needed constantly, on commuter runs with frequent daily cycles, on industrial switching assignments that kept engines warm and oil circulating. The FM locomotives performed competently. The railroads where FM power failed most conspicuously were often the railroads that used it most intermittently. A locomotive held in reserve for peak periods, sitting cold for weeks before being called, was a locomotive being subjected to exactly the conditions that this engine tolerated poorly. The FM engine did not decay because it was weak. It decayed because the railroads did not yet understand that for some engines, stopping is what does the damage. Today, only 2 intact examples of the H-16-44 are known to survive. Both are in Mexico, one at the National Rail Museum in Puebla, formerly displayed at the Chihuahua Al Pacifico shops, and another on display at Nuevo Casas Grandes in Chihuahua. The final H-16-44 ever built was completed in 1963 for the Ferrocarril de Chihuahua al Pacifico, making Mexico both the last customer for these locomotives and the last place where examples can still be seen. The opposed-piston engine itself lives on. Fairbanks-Morse Defense, the corporate descendant of the original company, continues to manufacture the 38D8, 1.8, and related engines in Beloit, Wisconsin. They power Coast Guard cutters, naval auxiliary vessels, and stationary power plants. They do what they were designed to do, run continuously, reliably, for extended periods. The engine was never truly a failure. It was misapplied, taken from an environment of constant operation and placed into one of intermittent use. It behaved in ways that its operators could not understand, and its maintainers could not fix.